It's the problem that Jewish people face, not necessarily related to the gospel or to Jesus himself, but to God himself. Because Jewish people ask the question, where was God when 6 million Jewish people died? If indeed we are the chosen people, and that's what the Bible teaches. Look at the 5 books of Moses, Genesis 12, Deuteronomy 7, Deuteronomy 30. It's all throughout the Bible that the Jewish people were chosen by God for a purpose. And a Jewish person might say, well, what kind of purpose was that? Was it our purpose to be born to suffer? To be unjustly treated? Well, shalom again. This is Mitch Glaser, president of Chosen People Ministries. So glad that you're taking a few moments to hear about one of the most important periods of Jewish history and of Jewish mission history. And you can read all about it in the book that I wrote called Jewish Missions in the Shadow of the Holocaust. Because the Holocaust today casts a giant shadow over missions to the Jews because it shaped Jewish attitudes towards Christianity. And Jewish people, unfortunately, cannot distinguish between the person of Jesus and Christians, his followers. Because many Christians who were allegedly followers of Jesus were not very good followers, and many of them may be forced by gunpoint. That's the most merciful thing I could say. But many of them actually embraced the anti-Semitism that was proclaimed and lived and insisted on by Hitler himself. And remember, it wasn't just Hitler; it was all of his generals and all of his chiefs of staff. And it was a terrible season for the Jewish people. And so the Jewish people were persecuted. But I remember one incident that was really important to me. I was visiting Germany with a group of Chosen People friends, and we went to Berlin before we traveled elsewhere in Germany, and eventually went to Poland and went to Auschwitz. It was a very moving trip the entire time. And so we went to the home of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a brave, courageous man. Dietrich Bonhoeffer actually had moved, a Lutheran pastor, Cost of Discipleship, you probably know the book, moved to the United States, attended Union Theological Seminary, which is across the street from Jewish Theological Seminary. So Dietrich Bonhoeffer had a lot of Jewish friends, and he really loved the Jewish people, genuinely. And he began seeing what was happening in Germany. And so Bonhoeffer, of course, opposed Hitler. Very controversial, whether or not he actually was involved in a bomb plot. We'll see him and we'll ask him. But it was a very difficult time for Bonhoeffer. And Bonhoeffer, right before the very last moments of the war, who had been arrested and was hung at a German prison. And so Bonhoeffer is a symbol of German evangelical, Protestant, born-again Christian courage. He stood against Hitler, and it cost him his life. He's a good example. Then there were others, and they were alleged Christians, unlike Bonhoeffer. If you saw the movie Schindler's List, you remember that one scene that was just mind-boggling to me, where the commandant of the concentration camp, a nice blonde-looking guy with a blonde-looking wife and beautiful little children, they were celebrating Christmas around the Christmas tree. And of course, Steven Spielberg did this intentionally, the contrast. And so they looked like wonderful Christians that were devoted to their faith. And then the next day, you saw the commandant ordering Jews to be sent to the gas chambers. And he was cruel and mean. Was he a Christian? Only God knows. I'm not going to be his judge. But did he act like a Christian? Not in my opinion. I don't think he acted like a Christian at all. And it's people like that commandant that Jewish people think about when they think about the gospel, because we all lost relatives in the Holocaust. 3 million Polish Jews, 500,000 German Jews, probably 500,000 Hungarian Jews. I would say 90% of the 300,000 Belarusian Jews where my family was from. And so all of us, particularly my generation and the generation before me, had their lives shaped when it came to Christianity by the Holocaust. They didn't live in Eastern Europe or Western Europe, where there was a lot of anti-Semitism. They probably were raised in the U.S., but their parents and their grandparents and uncles and aunts all had the same attitude about Christianity forged by the horrors of the Holocaust. And so Christianity lives in the shadow of the Holocaust when it comes to proclaiming the gospel among the Jewish people. When we think about Jesus, we think about Christianity. And when we think about Christianity, we don't think about Bonhoeffer. We don't think about the sacrificial death of Jesus on a tree on Golgotha, saying, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." We don't think about that. We think of this commandant from Auschwitz who one day was celebrating Christmas with his beautiful family and the next day murdering Jewish people. And so how does the Holocaust impact modern-day Jewish missions? Well, certainly it gives a very negative attitude towards Christianity, and since Jewish people have a hard time separating Jesus from his followers, it causes a very disparate view about Jesus, a very negative view about Jesus. And so when Jewish people look at you, my dear Christian friend, they think of the evils of Christianity, but when they watch you live, when they hear you speak, when they see the way you treat them, it creates a disparity in their minds. How could a follower of Jesus who was so negative to the Jews during the Holocaust period be such a nice person and so kind and so gracious? So your light is one candle in the midst of really deep darkness when it comes to Jewish attitudes towards the gospel. Secondly, there's another problem. And that problem is not so easily solved even by our life and by our testimony. And that is the problem of evil. It's the problem that Jewish people face, not necessarily related to the gospel or to Jesus himself, but to God himself. Because Jewish people ask the question, where was God when 6 million Jewish people died? If indeed we are the chosen people, and that's what the Bible teaches. Look at the 5 books of Moses, Genesis 12, Deuteronomy 7, Deuteronomy 30. It's all throughout the Bible that the Jewish people were chosen by God for a purpose. And a Jewish person might say, well, what kind of purpose was that? Was it our purpose to be born to suffer, to be unjustly treated, to have almost half of our population slaughtered mercilessly by alleged Christians? Where was God when all this happened? And these are deep-rooted questions. And you can tell a Jewish person, well, read the book of Job or read some of the Psalms where you see that even King David suffered, but he never lost his faith in God. Still, we must have deep compassion for Jewish people who don't know the Lord, and they're really struggling with this. There are a lot of books written post-Holocaust, like Richard Rubinstein's book, which question whether or not God exists. And then there were other ones that were written where you can see some Jewish people actually became more Orthodox Jewish people. Their faith in God was encouraged because God preserved the Jewish people. They saw through it. But it's really mixed. And so I would say most Jewish people question the existence and the goodness of God because of the evils of the Holocaust. And so when you're talking to Jewish people about the Lord, remember this. Be sensitive to it. And I like to say, when asked, where was Jesus when the Jewish people were being killed? I would say, in a spiritual sense, he was carrying his cross through the camps. He was there weeping and dying with his people, not literally, but spiritually. Jesus identified as a Jew, identified with Israel, and he knew he was the Jewish Messiah, called to suffer and to die. And so Jesus himself knew what it was to suffer and then to remain faithful to the God who allowed him to suffer. That's my prayer for my own family. That's my prayer, was my prayer for my grandparents and for my parents. My prayer for a lot of Jewish people who live in the shadow of the Holocaust and when approached about the gospel, think of the evil perpetrated against the Jews by quote-unquote Christians, and then deal with the deeper, really metaphysical, philosophical, but heartfelt issue as to whether or not God is good. And therefore, if Jesus is God, whether or not he is good. But let's remember, God is good and Jesus was good. And Jesus did take on humanity to experience our sin and our grief and our suffering and our alienation from God. So he understands us. And you might just encourage your Jewish friend to keep reading, to stay on the journey, and to see whether or not, from their own perspective, God proves himself to be good.